My name's Shane Huntley, and I wrote this presentation with a colleague of mine, Morgan Marquis-Bois. And we're talking today about journalists as targets, specifically journalists are the targets of state-sponsored and government hacking. Unfortunately, Morgan was unable to make it here today, but I'll do my best to keep you entertained. And we'll see where it goes from there. We're going to cover out why we're talking about journalists, and I really want to talk about the actual threats we see. I think there's a lot of kind of theoretical threats, and there's also a lot of hyped threats out there, and there's a lot of people who are kind of selling fear, selling advanced persistent threat, and all these other sort of kind of buzzwords. But we're kind of in a good position that we actually have seen a lot of these attacks for real, and I really want to paint a picture of like what's going on the ground as far as we see it. And I want to talk about the regional variation as well. I don't want to just talk about NSA like Mr. Snowden. I don't want to just talk about China. I want to kind of get a bit of a variety of how journalists are being targeted in different ways, depending on whether they're citizen journalists or whether they're coming from the Middle East or other parts of the world. And there are some key differences which I think is interesting to look at. And then we'll maybe talk a bit about what we can do. So one thing we do as my job in Google, and I will say not everything I'm talking about here is Google work, and my opinions are mine, not my employers, but one thing that Google does is we actually identify our users that are the targets of state-sponsored attacks. And that's pretty much anyone that we believe is being directly targeted by phishing, malware, or something that we can actually tie to a group or a campaign which we don't think this is cybercrime, we don't think this is for profit. We are pretty sure that we believe that this is actually either being done directly by government or by kind of government-supported actors. And we do this periodically, primarily as a mechanism to give these users this information. And there's tens of thousands of these kind of every couple of months. And we just warned another bunch of these users last week, almost 50,000 in fact. And as we've done this over time, Morgan and I have really noticed that certain groups of people are massively overrepresented in the people that we're constantly telling that they're the target of state-sponsored attacks. And one group that's disproportionately targeted is journalists of all stripes and from all around the world, and they're being attacked from everywhere in the world as well. So everyone in the world is attacking journalists everywhere in the world in different state-sponsored mechanisms. And because of that, we decided to let's try and draw an overall picture about what that means for journalism today. And that's kind of was the kind of motivation behind this talk. Very, very kind of, I really don't want to teach an American history lesson because even though I live in America, I'm an Australian and I still find Americans a little bit weird. But Americans do have this whole First Amendment thing, so it's just like freedom of the press. And it's really important there, and freedom of expression is massively important to the US, and it's massively important to Google, and it's also important around the world. But this was like the 18th century. Oops. And it made amendment number 1. It wasn't like 23, and it wasn't like in the 20th century. They saw that it was that important that time. And in more modern times, there's like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is that the freedom of expression, the freedom to impart ideas through media is considered like central to like civil society. And why is this? And one of the best examples is Watergate, and which really was that I've talked to journalists and read a lot about journalism, and they really see that one of the roles of journalism is holding the powerful to account. It's been described in the British system as the fourth estate, as in one of the key parts of like society and kind of governance of this is the kind of checks and balances of the system. And even in the US, like the media in the heyday of investigative journalism actually took down a president. So if you don't think governments are interested in people that are capable of taking down entire governments, then what are they interested in? And another interesting thing which I think ties into modern times is this idea of actually the confidentiality that journalists need to have is key to how they do their job. Like nobody's going to be a confidential informant, or very few people are. It requires much more bravery to be a confidential informant if you don't think the journalist can keep the secret. And the Watergate source was actually secret for 30 years. And the government really didn't go after, didn't push, and didn't actually force him to reveal, even though in the US there is no actual decided constitutional protection on the value of sources. But sources are in true danger and really are a key part of society. And you really see what is actually happening to some of the leakers, whatever you believe what they're doing, if they really are putting their lives on the line. So there really is serious consequences to leaking. So this is part of it. But so that's the whole why journalists are important. But the other thing is like spying, right? I'm not going to try and take a moral position on spying, but it's described as the second oldest profession. And so long as there is like governments, so long as there are people are going to want information. And journalists have great contact networks, and traditionally, or especially in more recent times, they don't necessarily have the greatest operational security. So this kind of makes them a perfect target, because everything we see about kind of targeted hacking as opposed to the recreational hacking or the kind of money hacking that we see, the biggest characteristic of state-sponsored hacking is they go where the intelligence is, and they go where the intelligence which is of value to their governments. And there's different places that's held. It's held in other governments. It's held in sort of protest groups. But more often than not, the journalists are this great way that they actually know people on both sides, and they actually have these sources, they have these contacts, and therefore they make direct targets for like national security reasons or state security reasons. And this goes all the way back too in terms of like, even the US with its freedom of press had, when back in the last time or one of the previous times NSA was having these scandals, just to show how history repeats itself, that declassified documents show that like NSA was spying on the New York Times, and this kind of led to the Church Committee and one of the previous sort of reworks of the NSA Charter. And so they had this Project Minaret where they kind of declared people as sort of state security risks, and they were kind of spying on their communications back in a kind of pre-digital age of kind of listening into phone calls. So, and that's kind of, this has been going along a long time, but I think things are different now. Like, journalism is rapidly changing. It's both becoming a lot better, but also in some ways a little bit worse. That there's actually a huge competition from the newspapers. They're having to compete with, citizen journalism, have to compete with bloggers. They don't have the classified ads to kind of pull in all their money anymore. They're having to compete with Google ads or all these other mechanisms. So in many ways, they have more tools at their disposal than ever before, except there's not nearly as much money, so there's not really as much the budgets for investigative journalism. So the heavy lifting is being really picked up by the kind of people doing the leaking, people on the ground, citizen journalism, and we're seeing, people with handy cams uploading to YouTube, as opposed to having to have that kind of, in Vietnam, you'd have the kind of on-site reporter with his kind of actual camera sending the film back, and he'd actually be an employee of a news organization. Now you actually have the guy who's part of the Syrian opposition or the Egypt protest movements on the ground. So this line of what journalism is these days is broader than ever. And we're also in the age of leaks as well, of, it's easy for information to be given to journalists as well. This is a picture of one of my colleagues in the office. We don't always dress like this, but just on special occasions. I'll go through some specific threats and attacks these days that we've actually seen. I'm going to be a little bit vague about some of them because I don't have permission to out every target or out every attacker, and I want to be 100% sure, but I think I can give you a pretty good overview of a lot of the real things that have happened in the last couple of years. So let's start back at kind of a fairly famous incident known as Aurora, or the China incident with Google. So as probably anybody who works in computer security knows, that late 2009, Google actually detected a intrusion on their network, and they identified that it had originated in China. And I think these days we'd say that, it looks to have some level of state-sponsored attack to it. And this is actually a pretty watershed moment, one, because Google actually took a stand against China about this on a lot of different issues, but also was probably one of the big first kind of victims of all this activity actually going public. But what wasn't really picked up is that at the time, Google was brave and said they were hacked, and I wasn't there at the time. But well, kind of not many people picked up at the time or remember that at the time they said they had clearly identified that over 20 other organizations were hacked. And they came from a wide range of businesses. This was just one attacker coming from China, and they were able to definitively say they had owned 20 other organizations. And in that list, again, was media. And as we've gone on, it's obviously made a lot more interest, and there's been huge amounts of kind of tracking of and understanding of kind of Chinese. APT is the term. There's been APT1, there's been Night Dragon, there's been so many groups, so many things kind of put out there now. And I think there's a massively greater comprehensive picture about Chinese hacking in the modern world amongst hacking from many other nations. But again and again, both from this group and other groups, when we examine a group, one of the things we do in our kind of threat intel work is we work out who are they targeting. And we make a list going, okay, these guys are targeting kind of oil industry and the media. These ones are targeting, economics and the media. And again, we'll have this list that they'll be targeting a couple of different things, but I think one of the most common, if not the most common targets of all the groups in every aspect is the media, that they're going, we'll target the actual specific thing we're after, plus we'll also target the journalists involved in it. But so the journalists are always seen as part of this campaign, and in some ways I think they're the weaker part of it, because one, journalists aren't security people, and there has been this push post-Aurora that the companies are actually getting better. The companies are really believing in the threat. There's all these products out there. People are understanding it. People are setting up threat intel. People are sending their people to conferences like Black Hat. And they're starting to understand the threat. But these kind of on-the-ground journalists and activists are probably lagging behind a little bit. So another specific, much more recent one, and I can't name the exact organization. This is a major media organization. And this is just the modern variant of it, that sending out malware, they're pretending to be like another office, and this is an international organization, pretending to be the Beijing office, and they're sending out these documents with the exploits. And this is where the actual organizational security fails down, that it was opened by at least 10 employees. And in the kind of the follow-up and the discussions, it was like, oh, but we had all these security products installed. And this wasn't particularly advanced malware. It wasn't even, it was an exploit, but it was an exploit that had been patched like at least 12 months ago. But there's this feeling that, I've bought an antivirus, I've gone to the vendor hall in Black Hat, and I've bought like at least half their products. And, the antivirus said it was fine, my mail gateway said it was fine. But in reality, that's not enough when it is a targeted attack, because these were specifically pretending to be their office. They only sent it to a small number of people. They tweaked it so it didn't turn up with anything on VirusTotal. So they tested against the AV scanners as well, and they sent it out, and they were able to compromise those people. And this is the thing we see literally every day in some aspects, that we see this targeting is going on the internet. It's not super sophisticated, but this is the Chinese mechanism generally, is you see the zip files, the PDFs, the RTFs, and it's just sheer volumes from all the different groups, whatever the area is. And I think their success rate's low, their detection rate is really high, but just in sheer volume it works. So this is a different story from a totally different part of the world, though, is that this is actually a government in the Middle Eastern area. And this is actually where, national newspaper is actually being targeted directly by their own government, something which we hopefully don't have to deal with as much around here, or in the Western world, but it's definitely prevalent in the Middle East. And in this case, there was total act of compromise. There were people pulled in, they were doing the forensics. And when it got down to it, they identified that yes, there was malware installed. And when we and others looked at what the malware was, it was actually this tool called FinFisher. I don't know if people have heard of FinFisher. But FinFisher is a great tool. It's available cross-platform. It's kind of has backdoors. There's all these modules for it. It has great capabilities. but it's a commercial tool. Supposedly one that's only sold to nice, friendly governments, and I definitely wouldn't call this particular Middle Eastern government a friendly government. But this is a company that's based in the UK and Germany, and they sell these tools, and these tools are turning up on media organizations of people. And example of kind of showing that this definitely is for sale directly to kind of these repressive type governments is, this is actually a document that was seized when the Mubarak regime fell. And this is actually pulled from like the kind of equivalent of the secret police headquarters. And it's a kind of purchase order to buy all the FinFisher software. And it was sold for what, 287,000 euros or something, which I'd kind of describe as like, that sounds like a lot for software, but in reality, it's kind of dictator pocket change. It's the sort of, what they spend on gold taps and for their bathroom, maybe for their third bathroom. And it's from that you can buy really a kind of whole hacking capability, which allows you to kind of really get into your kind of whatever you want, including your domestic newspaper that might have some issue and make something, say bad things about your corruption or something like that. And Morgan's done a lot of research with his Citizen Lab work and actually looking at where FinFisher servers are located around the world, and found that there is quite a considerable number. It is a very popular product. They really do provide great service. They provide great training, ongoing support. If you're like a police force or a security service, you can write them a check and they'll sell it. Though apparently only to friendly governments. That's what they say. So I suppose citizen journalists, I think citizen journalists is actually kind of where the future of this is, because just look at the reporting we're seeing from around the world. If you want to know what's going on in the Syrian civil war, there is some good reporting coming out from the traditional news organizations, but the people that are really capturing the real images on the ground of like what's going on when there's a gas attack or what's actually happening kind of in these places where the fighting's actually going on, huge amounts of this is actually coming from the citizen media. And this organization, I'll pronounce it horribly, is mumforkinch.com. And this was this citizen media project, and it grew out of the Arab Spring, early 2011. And it's quite critical of Morocco and its fairly draconian government. And earlier last year, it won an award for Google for its voices to defend and promote freedom of speech and rights across the internet. So it won this great award doing freedom of speech. And so 11 days later, however, they receive an email, and this email was, not there to congratulate them on their award. So I'll pull my notes because I don't speak French. And this is an example of just really good targeting. That the email was titled "Denunciation," and it was this attempt to be a denunciation, and it's a link to what looks like a Word document. It's saying that it's a scandal, and it has a single line of French there saying, which translates something as, "Please do not mention my name." So it's a plea as a kind of confidential source. Here's a scandal. Here's what's going on. So this is it's a great bait, because let's face it, journalists have to open things from sources. So they try to open the file, and when they open it, again, due to some of the poor security of how we've built things, it actually ends up being a jar, and it actually has malware, and it actually turns out to be another commercial hacking tool. And this same hacking tool was found by targeting by what looks like the Ethiopians. So this organization called ESAT, which is a media organization formed in Ethiopia, it's actually based in the US. And late last year, we're seeing these attackers, again, this is kind of, I keep saying, you may be like laughing that these are low-level things, but these things are the things that are actually working at the moment. That they're actually, over a couple of hours, they made 3 separate attempts to target these employees of ESAT with sophisticated computer spyware. And the first attempt, can anyone see what's wrong with this picture? Hopefully, yes. So it's obvious. Even the people spotted this, right? Like, this is the example of like how the governments are pulling out at the moment at the low end. That they're actually like, it's a RAR file. It has an exe. Please accept this article. Didn't work. And when we looked at what it was, Morgan discovered that it was a tool by Hacking Team. And Hacking Team are an Italian-based company which also sell surveillance target. And this is from one of their great kind of sales pitches about, it's called RCS, and it allows you to be invisible to the target, gets you encrypted voice, relationships, target location, web browsing, all these things that kind of totally compromise that if you just run these things. And everyone's really worried about all this like encryption and other sort of aspects, but if you can just trick your user into installing this, it's all game over. And again, Morgan's mapped actually like where this is around the world. And if you look at it, it's not exactly the map of, the kind of, this isn't a map of the greatest freedom of expression loving countries in the world. And so going back to like, that didn't work. They didn't run the exe and the RAR. So these guys are actually like talking to them like, this shouldn't actually be an exe. You're trying to send me a doc. And they quickly come back and saying, oh, sorry, here's a doc. And then they quickly send a doc. And the doc has the same malware in it. And so this is the depressing thing. This is what's happening and this is what's working. So I got the doc and, RTF. So for those who don't know, RTF is rich text format. So it's kind of like it's meant to be like ASCII text with a bit of markup that allows you to kind of make things a little bit more kind of express Word docs, sort of, but in a format that's meant to be cross-platform. And it's kind of like a legacy format. It's used in Outlook. It's kind of used as a compatibility layer. It's an open format. But for the last couple of years, it's had a lot of vulnerabilities. And due to the fact that people have pirated Office and people have old versions of Office, it has become the workhorse exploits of both the government people and increasingly the cybercrime people. Like, it used to be PDF, everyone used to joke about PDFs, but these days, rich text format is totally taking over. So this is an exploit, we kind of refer it to as quad 3 in the Office, because it's 2010 exploit. But we see this, again, every day targeting users. And the reason is it's such a beautiful exploit. It's just a straight Stack Overflow. It's like the sort of exploit that I was writing as, a much younger hacker back in, 2000 and back in like the early 2000s or 1990s. It's like a straight Stack Overflow. You just specify the fragments. And then you specify a return address, which is the second red box. And then it jumps directly to the shellcode. You see the 90, 90, 90, 90 there, which is like a NOP sled, starts executing. So this is like the entirety of the exploit. Everything beyond that gets executed. There's none of this advanced like ROP chains or any of this complicated stuff. You get it right. More amusingly, we see this exploit all the time. The biggest problem with this exploit is that at least half the people using it have no idea how to find a good return address. So if you know how these exploits work, you need to have like one fixed point in memory where it jumps back to. And there's a couple of those, and you do some research and it kind of works. But we find they obviously sometimes only test on their own version of Windows. So at least half the time, the Chinese send an exploit that only works on Chinese Windows, even though they're sending it to people in the USA. So I build automatic malware analysis systems, and I have this entire module kind of like system that's part of the whole processing these exploits, and I call it the exploit repairman. That I repair the exploits so I'm able to run them to make it work, because half the exploits out there are kind of low quality that they won't actually work. So this is actually one of the kind of things that's most time consuming in analyzing this stuff, is actually the low quality of some of their exploits. So RTF was patched in 2010. 2012 we actually had a different one. Actually got the number wrong there. But this one's actually a little bit harder to analyze, but this is kind of weird. It's like a rich text format, right? It's a text format. But in the end, you can actually embed other doc files in it. You can embed OLE, you can embed COM. This is like, the attack surface here is almost infinite. And this is why we're able to like see that this is the newer exploit that is actually, again, more and more common, very high success rates, used to deliver everything under the sun. So this one's kind of cool, in that here's the new one. You probably haven't seen it yet. This was actually found by myself and one of my colleagues, and we reported it to Microsoft just this month. And Microsoft actually put out a fix-it on Monday for it. So we actually found this being used in the wild by another government, just in small numbers. Again, they're only targeting, a very small number of users, but there happen to be journalists on that list as well, so that's why I'm willing to put it in this talk, that again, the first place this exploit was used, it looks like it was probably purchased, but again, it's a very successful exploit. And as kind of the reporting here says, it's like, this is kind of where you could do better. It's 2014 and, opening an RTF file or even possibly viewing it in the preview pane. So I expect anybody who's doing this sort of research is going to see this CVE number a lot, because especially now it's gone semi-public, that there's going to be a lot of copycats on this one, because it is a very nice exploit. And again, used in the wild, and like we're seeing more and more. So as a general picture on exploits, what I'll say is that a lot of the targeting by the governments isn't using exploits at all. They're using, often they're just sending the RAR files, they're sending the zip files, they're sending the documents directly. And the reason is that users will click on it and we don't have enough protections. The next kind of level we actually see, and we saw that with the ESAP, the next level of escalation is they'll pull out one of the older exploits because it's safe, they don't care if it's burnt. But as we saw with the latest RTF ones, the new ones are there. And we've had a fair bit of success, me, some of my colleagues and stuff, and Google and other people are reporting them, that we'd say that with regularity, at least like once every 3 months, we'll be finding a 0-day that's kind of a content exploit, usually against something like IE or Word, and then we see that actually being kind of used by government actors. We report it, it gets patched, and it gets used more. But with kind of clockwork regularity, there are a small number of groups that have these exploits, but the vast majority don't. So you'd have to kind of be unlucky to be targeted by the 0 days. You kind of should feel kind of honored if they actually pull one out for you. And to be honest, I don't think it buys them that high a success rate, but we definitely see that they are out there, and there's definite evidence that they're for sale, that there's the companies that are actually openly selling exploits for government use, and there's also these black markets that we definitely believe there are a small number of people responsible for the large amount of exploits. And I'd like to hope to kind of reduce that market, or at least compete with that market to actually get some of these kind of off the market. So how do we actually solve this? And I've kind of talked to a lot of journalists, I've talked to a lot of activists, and the big solution a lot of the time in the community is actually circumvention tools. Everyone jumps to VPNs, Tor, encryption, PGP, and these are all great tools. They definitely protect against threats. They're definitely really important in terms of understanding what they are. I push back a little bit. It's an argument that Morgan and I actually have a little bit about some of these circumvention tools, is that it does worry me that I sometimes feel that they're kind of sprinkled around like magic pixie dust, that you just go to a website, you get some big list of all these tools to install, you get this nice like Windows machine, and suddenly you're installing 10 Chrome extensions, 7 proxy tools, and you have all these things installed, and then suddenly people believe they're safe, not really understanding what it does. Like, do people really understand, like, if you use Tor, what does that actually mean? Who can see your traffic now versus who could see your traffic before? What attacks are you vulnerable to? What attacks are you less vulnerable to? What attacks are you more vulnerable to? Though the biggest one we're seeing now is actually backdoored circumvention tools. That the circumvention tools really do work, but as part of that, we're seeing like a nice new attack surface, that the whole, installing circumvention tools is all about, in many cases these are distributed through kind of informal channels, and then suddenly, You've had people installing exes off random places on the internet and their friends. So we have this new thing of like, that's great. If you're going to run executables, let's just send you some executables that look like circumvention tools or backdoored circumvention tools. And we've definitely seen this. This tool, Simurg, was actually an Iranian tool. It's been used to bypass censorship in Iran since 2009. It's less than a megabyte, which is great because the internet's not particularly fast in Iran. And it's kind of very convenient. It's also passed around a lot by USB because there's a lot of this kind of informal sort of things there. So unfortunately, the one on the left is what the real installer looks like. The one on the right, it's not even an installer, it just runs. The one on the right is like a whole like installer, and this drops a complete like VB malware, backdoors the machine. So suddenly this user who's trying to get past all this like circumvention tools has immediately just installed the backdoor directly. And we're seeing this is kind of becoming a trend. In sort of mid-2013, we saw the kind of FreeGate did the same thing. We saw backdoored versions of FreeGate. And on the end, it's been inverted somehow. But we actually see that this is a commercial rat. So we're actually seeing that this is targeting the Syrian opposition. And it's actually, it was a campaign, it was masquerading as a call to arms saying install these sort of tools, and then suddenly they install it and it's a commercial rat. And again, Tor, which is kind of one of the most powerful tools people have to actually protect anonymity, is actually also backdoor versions of that are turning up as well. And this was targeted, this was seen to be sent around by email. It was sent to Tibetan news organizations. So this is journalists really, and citizen journalists really kind of worried about their sources, worried where they're connecting to, and then getting emailed these backdoor circumvention tools. So this is kind of, again, low-tech trends, but identifying how the weaknesses are there. And to get a little bit closer to where we currently are, we're also seeing everybody's getting into this game, and Vietnam has been, and Vietnamese, I should say, have been very kind of heavily targeted over the last 12 months. We've got bloggers, a blogger was targeted kind of early in the year, last year, and then her machine was totally compromised, but then suddenly, as a result, personal information ended up online. That is kind of, which was a great form of intimidation, like contact details, private photos, all kind of getting out onto the internet, which is, it definitely has a mechanism to kind of make people think twice about speaking out or blogging. And this isn't just targeting within Vietnam, this is really comprehensive, like the number of accounts, the number of kind of malware being sent out in volumes that, almost anything done in the Vietnamese language around the internet, that if you're writing something in the Vietnamese language or a Vietnamese expat group, anything part of the Vietnamese diaspora, you really are going to be sent some of this malware over the last 12 months. We've got mathematicians in France, got EFF bloggers in late last year, and even seeing, again, tying to the reporters of like, they're not just linking to like citizen bloggers, but also the Associated Press. So I kind of talked about all the malware and stuff some of the malware being stuff sent out, but kind of the great secret of like phishing is like, phishing is actually what I think is the most serious threat to the internet at the moment, which is kind of a crazy thing to say because I used to be a Windows rootkit guy, and then I was kind of an exploits guy, and I really did consider, especially before I started at Google and started getting involved in web stuff, it's like, if you didn't control EIP and you didn't control the exploit, then it really is lame stuff. But in reality, we've moved to this world now that I'm guessing almost everybody in this room is able to access their work systems, their personal systems from here. And in general, I think most of the time, you're going to be doing that through credentials. And so if you can get credentials, you don't need to own the machine. And something that came out in June 2011 is we actually saw that really comprehensive targeting that Google identified as being specifically from Jinan, China. And it was actually targeting the personal accounts too of individuals. So this is and there were very many media figures here, as well as military figures, as well as some very senior US officials and US government types. And again, if you can't hack Google, trick the user for their credentials. If you can't hack Microsoft, trick the user for their credentials, and then in many cases, that will get you everything you need to know. Remember, these are professionals. These aren't about trying to pull off a cool hack. All these guys want is the information in the account. They actually want this information, they want the contacts, they want the social information, and more this information is online in some ways, or is available online if they can get access to these credentials. So this is actually a pretty well engineered, this is one we just found last week, being sent out, and it's really close. Like, it's probably pixel perfect except for the URL bar of exactly like what a Google login page looks like these days. And this is being sent out, it harvests the credentials, they move on, and we'll see it, they'll try and access the accounts. And I'll tell you who is really good at phishing these days is the group calling themselves the Syrian Electronic Army. They are comprehensively getting into Twitter accounts. They were able to compromise Microsoft employees and get specific information about their legal processes. And just across the board, the Syrian Electronic Army and the Syrian group, which is expressing their support for Assad, is that we haven't actually seen them pull out malware that's any more advanced than anything they can download from the net for at least $3 or $50, but they're in some ways pulling off bigger hacks than anyone else is just by tricking people from their credentials. So here's the great one from just a few months back, where they actually managed to get the Associated Press Twitter account, and they actually said 2 explosions in the White House, Barack Obama is injured. And then immediately from one of their other ones, it was able to do it. So what effect do you think this has on the world, besides being kind of very funny, is that, like, look at this chart. That's actually the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Like, that immediate dip there represents like 1% of the value of the US stock market as an instantaneous drop in trading value. So that probably represents, get it back of the envelope, probably about, the net worth of all the companies in terms of trading. Like, that's a $150 billion drop in terms of like what US companies are worth. So if you could actually trade on that information or kind of do something wrong or be a little bit more subtle on what they did, you can have some pretty interesting effects. And this is kind of a small group phishing people for credentials, having, I'm sure some people had some horrible trades on that, and some people doing automatic trading probably either lost or gained a lot of money in that little spike there. Every time the market moves, some high-speed trader wins or loses. I really think we have to solve phishing. If I had, of all the things we had to fix in the world, I think actually phishing is actually the first one. I think all these other sort of systems beyond that only kind of go away when we can stop users being tricked for their credentials. And we've actually seen this of I don't think I've said this to anyone before, but I think the Jinan group is actually interesting, that the Jinan group that we actually saw doing the phishing of the high-level officials, they also send out malware. And we actually saw them make decisions in terms of, if they're kind of online presence, they go for phishing. If it's kind of like an offline sort of people with kind of running their own mail accounts, they'll send malware. So there's kind of this balance of kind of, they see that phishing is at least up there as a valid way of hacking just as much as malware or exploits. But it's never treated as much. It's never treated the same way. It's not treated with the same respect at a Black Hat conference as kind of some cool new exploit. But it can be definitely acceptable. We are, in kind of Google is tried to move beyond passwords. Passwords are dead. Two-factor authentication, trying to verify identities. And more people moving towards this. The whole point of two-factor authentication, and hopefully all of you run some form of two-factor authentication, is that you don't just provide the password. And it's especially important for password reuse, because we see a lot of these attacks on Twitter accounts and other things is they'll get one password of trick you into this, and then everybody uses the same password everywhere else. Especially in the cybercrime world, people will hack some crazy little website written in PHP, written by 2 guys who've never done security. They steal the whole password database and they'll use it against Google, where we have pretty good security. and it works. And similarly, if you get somebody's personal account, it probably matches the Twitter account, and we've seen it kind of move that way. So two-step verification is important. But the next kind of, it still falls down that you can be tricked to provide the second factor. And so Google's actually said that they're trying to move beyond just passwords or just something you can be tricked for. Because I think the real solution to this is you have to create something the user cannot be tricked out of providing, because users will always be tricked into providing credentials. We've done red teams, we've done pen tests. When I used to do pen tests, generally we ended up getting banned from using phishing because phishing people for creds just worked every time and it didn't prove anything. It's like, yeah, we know phishing works. It works against security people, it works against engineers, it works against PhDs, it works against mums and dads. If you send out enough, phishing will work. So this thing is an early prototype of something Google said they're working on. It's called a security key. And it's actually, instead of just providing a code like some of the YubiKeys at the moment, it actually has crypto in it, and it kind of links into the Chrome browser with an open standard, where it actually sends like a signed thing to the Google login process. So I have kind of one here, and it only sticks out like literally a millimeter out of my machine. But every time I log in, I have to touch that, and then it actually kind of confirms. But if I was at that fake website, there's no way for that fake website that's not on google.com to trick me into pressing it. It doesn't matter if I press it on another website. And I think this makes you relatively unphishable. And Google has said they're like definitely trying to push this out into kind of this or some variant to it to consumers as quick as possible, because I think people who are under attack, like journalists and others, really need this sort of solution of not being able to be tricked, because user education is always put up as this panacea, but kind of user education is a nice thing, but we're engineers, we can do better. So all Geek presentations in an XKCD comic. So this comic talks about how, yeah, let's break RSA, let's talk about all those great attacks, but the $5 wrench. And I read this comic a while back, but a lot of the work that Morgan and I have done dealing with these people and dealing with journalists and dealing with bloggers and like all these repressive regimes of the world is, this kind of isn't a comic. This isn't a comic for a lot of these people in many parts of the world. You know, I definitely have sat down with users and got like the reports firsthand of, you know, they were held, they were tortured. There are many regimes in the world where, like, if you're in Iran and you're like a blogger, you definitely can get like raided and picked up off the streets. And the first-hand reports coming from kind of that part of the world especially is that, you know, one of the things they'll ask you for now is your Hotmail password, your Gmail password, your crypto keys. And this definitely needs to actually fall into our security model of like working out how to protect these people in terms of like how do you limit damage in those cases, because any model that breaks down on the $5 wrench really doesn't work. And it's something that Google Ideas has actually talked about in terms of like the next users we get as they grow in the world. And this is in terms of the internet in general, that, you know, the first billion or 2 billion users are kind of on the internet now, and they're generally from the first world. They're generally from relatively stable regimes on the whole. They definitely don't have like that much kind of, you know, not nearly as bad. But then you talk about the developing world, you talk about like the remaining 4 billion people that are really coming online, and many of those people are coming online from places which don't have the same rule of law, they don't have the same physical safety, they don't have the same civil institutions. So kind of the challenge that I'm putting, and it's the same for everybody, so the challenge I put to all security professionals is, how do you build security systems that kind of work for people in those kind of unstable places, as well as it works for people kind of who actually do have the protection of rule of law. And the other thing I'll say is the whole detaining thing, before I just point to other parts of the world, is that, you know, we have a pretty good example recently that the modern journalist can be detained anywhere, as we saw with Miranda, Glenn Greenwald's partner, who was working with him on the Snowden leaks, where he was just transiting through Heathrow and he was detained for 9 hours under terrorism provisions under UK law. And, you know, all his media, electronic devices, he was detained and questioned for 9 hours. And this was like August last year. And, was appealed. It went to the High Court in the UK, and they actually ruled that it was a valid use and it was okay for them to use these terrorism laws to detain for 9 hours. So if you're a journalist, it's not just Iran you have to be worried about kind of your security of your information. It's connecting through Heathrow as well, apparently. So kind of healthy paranoia, I suppose. And he definitely had like laptop, mobile phones, memory cards, all taken from him in that time. The last thing I want to talk about is, it's the kind of joke. There's the old quote that revolution will be televised, and it's becoming very true. The revolution will be televised on YouTube, and we've seen it through the Arab Spring, through the Syrian civil war, and that definitely makes kind of YouTube to be kind of a battleground. A recent trend we're actually seeing is like social media versus social media, and this is actually something put out by, they call themselves Syrians on YouTube, and they have like a large number of followers. These are pro-Assad. They accuse the opposition of being terrorists. But this page here is what they're doing is they're actually pulling out opposition videos that is documenting violence on YouTube and documenting kind of what's purported to be abuse by the Assad regime. And they're actually saying there, go to YouTube, flag this as a report, tell us this violent content, and tell us there's terrorism. So they're actually kind of getting all their followers on their side to go in and report the opposition's kind of videos as terrorist videos. So they're kind of abusing this whole process. And this is actually kind of tough to deal with. It adds this whole burden to how do you actually maintain freedom of expression while also kind of actually maintaining the kind of censorship and responsibility to not have terrorism, and it kind of puts a whole burden on the system. And the other way we see kind of journalism being targeted is just blocking. You've seen this? This is really cool. This is like the geekiest graffiti you've ever seen in your life. So this is actually in Turkey last week. So Turkey decided to block Twitter because people in Turkey were documenting a lot of corruption and other bad things supposedly being done by the Turkish government. So instead of passing around saying they were doing it fairly naively, that they were doing it at the DNS layer. So they're actually like putting up graffiti to say, go to Google DNS, you'll get through to Twitter that way. I know just this week that the Turkish government is now blocking YouTube as well because there's all these YouTube videos. So this is the other threat. It's kind of a different threat of journalists, but the threat of just actually being blocked or taken down. So this is where the circumvention tools and the kind of maintaining the internet uptime is also important. In terms of other crazy threats that you wouldn't have thought of for journalists that has been important, this is again just in the last week or two, and started a lot of debate, is that this case was, so Microsoft had an employee that had leaked some information about a Windows release. They leaked it to a journalist, blogger. And so they actually did the court filings, and one of the things they did is that the journalist was actually had their mail on Hotmail. And so they couldn't identify the employee that had leaked it, but Microsoft actually used the provisions, which turned out to be illegal to protect Microsoft, that they actually pulled the journalist's mailbox in order to identify the source against Microsoft. So this has got a lot of outrage, and I think nobody's said that it's illegal what they've done, but it's definitely a threat that I probably think the journalists didn't think of, being like, a journalist reporting on Microsoft, that suddenly Microsoft is going to be reading their email because of this. So again, there's so many different threats out there, and it requires a lot of nuance to work out who your adversary is. So I'll try and give a very quick summary of kind of how I see the regional variation. I'm kind of just doing this off the cuff, is that we see the whole gamut of spectrum, and we've talked about all of them, that we see there's the kind of the low-end Middle East guys or the Africans or whatever. They've bought their kind of tools from Gamma, they've bought their FinFisher, they've bought their RCS, and they're sending it out. They're pretty low end, but they're working, but it definitely works. And then you step up, and then elsewhere you see like I think I call them the electronic armies, the Iranian electronic army, Syrian electronic army. if they're your target, you really got to watch out for being phished. They're some of the best social engineers in the world. They will really work out what presses your buttons. They will trick you into something. They really know how to play the system. And then you move up to kind of, your Iran, your Tunisia. I didn't mention this in detail, but they're the kind of players that are looking at, fake DNS certificates, actually man-in-the-middling, actually using their infrastructure to control the journalists. And then there's the wider players, and then you step up to like your Chinas or whatever, which actually have your comprehensive programs, both military and kind of civilian, really targeting both state and national security, and they will just comprehensively go after all the different targets. And then you obviously have the Western of what's been revealed of they have the ability to use warrants, compel, and all this other spying, and also even detain journalists. So there's this variation in capability all the way along the spectrum of the really naive 2 university students to the APT-1 kind of building in Shanghai, which has multiple floors of professionally trained operators. And we really are seeing everything from a really naive RAR file with an exe in it, through to a 0-day RTF document that nobody knows anything about, or we see a flash vulnerability which allows to take over anybody's machine, totally unpatched, totally cross-platform. So there's a range of threats, and I think what I'd say to journalists is, know who you're dealing with, and also think about what sort of threats and who you're likely to go against and what the method of operation is. And that's kind of why I believe in threat intelligence, that threat intelligence doesn't actually solve the problem, but allows you to have some rough idea of what you're facing and allows you to know what to do. So back to the targeting, just to give one more indication of how prevalent it is. Here's the list of the Alexa top 25 news sites, and Morgan and I put together the databases we have access to and what we know of state-sponsored attacks, and we're able to, between us, work out that we can definitively say that we believe we've seen at least 21 out of the top 25 news sites targeted by state-sponsored attacks in some form. And that's kind of, so if you are in journalism, you are going to be targeted. In brief, I'd say how to solve this. I think we need to go back to this being an important part of the job. I think journalists have kind of forgotten. Back in the deep throat guys, these guys had dead letter drops. They were doing serious kind of they were doing serious OPSEC. They really saw it as this. I think there's this feeling now that computers are hard. I majored in English in college. I'm good at writing stuff, but really, if you want to get into this game, you are going to be targeted, and you don't need to be talking about something really sophisticated to be targeted either. If you touch anything to do with international relations at all, you are going to be targeted in some ways. Security industry, I really like the keynote. I think we need to do better. We need to build systems that are secure by default. I think the kind of holding up our hands and saying it's all up to user education and users being smarter, I think is kind of a cop-out. I think we can build systems better than people having to download exes off the web and double-clicking on them. We can make it so you don't have to think about every single document you open. And governments, yeah. I think it'd be nice if some of them tried to pretend to be good guys every so often. I think this year has been, everybody has ceded the moral high ground on their hacking efforts at the moment. So it's hard for any government to point the finger at any other government. It seems like everyone is doing all the hacking. I think I'll call it quits there and open up to any questions about hacking of journalists, threat intelligence, or random opinions on things. So we don't go into specifics for good reason of exactly how we identify all of them. So it's pretty much the sum of everything we've seen through all our detection mechanisms that kind of goes into our threat intelligence systems. And we're able to kind of all the attacks we see and all the things we detect, we're able to make a pretty good determination based on the targeting, what it links to, who's being targeted, and kind of we start categorizing. We can kind of draw the lines of, okay, this looks like cybercrime, Yeah, this is targeting journalists and Tibetans. We'll put that in the kind of state-sponsored, or we can definitely tie this to a specific attacker group. So, without going into too many specifics, and it doesn't mean they were compromised. It just means that we saw indications they were targeted. So. So, yeah, absolutely. Google has been doing a huge amount of efforts to try and protect against these internal threats. And one of the things is we do realize we have a lot of data, and one of the things is that there's a whole bunch of trust that we need to place there. So internally, we've done a lot of things. We're encrypting everything on links between. But internally, we really have been not treating people on the inside as trusted. So trying to create systems where there is like a single way to access the data. It is stored encrypted. It has to go through a specific broker. Every single transaction is logged. Only a tiny number of people have access to use the data. It's not like only a very tiny number of Google employees who have specific needs and very granular controls. And then all access is logged. So we try and create this system where we have one, good employees, and then we have systems that kind of minimize access and then audit the access, and then having people to actually audit it. And there's been a massive growth, investment in both security and privacy across that. And we're just trying to build that in. And then that's, I think, all we can do. And that hopefully, and we believe that we can actually have some trust in the system at that pace, that we will catch people if there is internal abuse, and we absolutely minimize the potential for abuse by people. So why are we going a little bit too much of me? I'm definitely on the security team. I'm definitely speaking in general research here, as opposed to being the official Google spokesperson on everything. But yeah, no, it's a general principle. Is that one is we should log the data we need to log, and log the data that's useful, and not overlog data. But without going to, I don't know what the specific data you're talking about in terms of what we shouldn't be logging versus what we are. Any questions anymore?
You talk about phishing as being a very effective way and effectively very simple stuff. I'm curious about cross-jurisdictional government access, so almost legal access to data. If I'm in Singapore, a government agency, I can kind of get data from you about Singaporean people, if I have a court order or whatever it is. Presumably, cross-jurisdictional, if I want to get court information about somebody in another country, that becomes a lot more problematic. And I'm curious how that's handled.
Okay, so the best place I'd point you to is the transparency report, which the transparency report actually shows, one, what government requests we get, from what countries, and in what cases the data is provided. Generally that, and it actually has the council. I don't even know if Singapore's on that list. There's only so there's only a certain number of countries that we will actually accept legal process from, and that's generally because they actually have compatible legal systems. I'm not the expert on that. I'd definitely point you to the transparency report, and it definitely shows you where we do and do not provide data. But generally, the biggest criticism is that we don't provide nearly as much data as people expect or want, and in many cases, we do not provide data, and definitely.
Do you list the countries you do not provide data to?
We list all the countries we do provide data to, so you can work it out which ones we don't to very easily. And yeah, and if you look, the really repressive regimes aren't there. When there's not Syria is not providing us court orders and getting data from us. Cool. Thanks very much.